Hello everyone, welcome to The Fetal Position, episode number 9. Today we're going to be discussing one of the more well-known pro-choice analogies, Judith Jarvis Thomson's The Violinist. Now, I know this is probably going to take a little bit of time to kind of flesh out the details of this and give it as much attention as I want to give it. So I'm not going to focus too much on anything before we get into the argument, but there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is that I've been kind of a slacker lately. As some of you guys probably know, I'm a part-time, I guess, blogger for a website called theologymix.com. They're a super cool website where they have a lot of people blogging, guest blogging for the site with a whole ton of content all the time. And I originally started off being an apologetics blogger occasionally whenever I kind of felt like putting anything up on their site. They were like, yeah, feel free, go for it. I wasn't able to commit to anything like regular because, well, I'm a slacker, but I did end up saying yes to committing to a bi-weekly apologetics column. Now, I've slacked off significantly, and I don't think I've posted anything in there for quite some time. But they started a Theology Mix network for podcasting, and I'm technically a part of it. Now, it takes a couple extra steps. It's really not a big deal for me. I don't know why I haven't done this. Like I said, I'm a slacker, but it's a couple extra steps to be able to put my podcast on their site, to be able to get it in their RSS feed. So if you go to the Theology Mix Network, that you can actually find that on iTunes. You can subscribe to that, and there's a whole ton of different podcasts that are kind of all not in the same vein, but they're all by contributors to Theology Mix. They're all a bunch of different podcasts. So my commitment now, even though it's episode 9, I guess better late-ish than never, I'm going to put every one of the episodes from here on out onto Theology Mix's website. They've been more than patient with me, even though I've committed to things that I haven't fulfilled. I'm going to continue to put this on there. So if you are a pre-existing listener to the Theology Mix Network, and this is the first time you have heard the fetal position on there, hello. Sorry that you're just diving in on episode 9. Episode 1 was up in the Theology Mixer radio, but it's been a while since episode 1. So yeah, I am going to be putting that on the Theology Mixer radio's website, theologymix.com, so that this podcast can be a part of the network, which I had originally planned on doing, but I just have been slacking off. So if you are, like I was saying, if you're listening to this for the first time via Theology Mix, I want to encourage you to jump back and listen to a few of the things that I've posted already. Episodes 2 through 8 will be not available on Theology Mixer Radio, and you can find those by going to thefetalposition.com or just searching on your whatever you're using currently to listen to me on the Theology Mixer Radio. You can just search for The Fetal Position. Subscribe to it either way, like onto Theology Mixer Radio or on The Fetal Position, because it is reflected on my stats either way. However, if you're going to leave a review for my podcast in particular, do so on search for my podcast and leave a review there, rating and review, because if you're going to be rating the whole chunk of Theology Mixer Radio or a particular podcast. So please do. I mean, if you feel so inclined to rate, review, share, all that stuff, do so with my podcast and with Theology Mixer Radio. Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about is, so if you've been listening regularly, I've been going through the development of my unborn child, Cole. My wife is currently at 39 weeks pregnant with Cole, so he's basically a newborn at this point. Only he's just still inside the womb. He's just hanging out. So what Baby Center for 39 weeks here says. Your baby's full term this week and waiting to greet the world. He continues to build a layer of fat to help control his body temperature after birth, but it's likely he already measures about 20 inches and weighs a bit over 7 pounds, about the size of a mini watermelon. So the last little while, every time I go to read these, the suggestion of what fruit or food the baby is always like lettuce or celery or some sort. I made a joke about the baby being salad, but now he is no longer salad. He is a small watermelon. It says here that boys tend to be slightly heavier than girls, and the outer layer of his skin are sloughing off as new skin forms underneath. There is, I'm sure I'm probably going to bring this up at some point within the next however many few months, probably, when I'm dealing with a newborn. But there are a handful of things that if you're dealing, I know actually a lot of the listeners in this show are expecting. They're going to be parents to a born child for the first time. A little side note. I'm going all over the place. I don't know what's wrong with me today. Anyway, so I'm hopefully I'll be able to remember everything I'm talking about. So as a side note, when someone says that they are a mother or a father to be, and it's because they are pregnant, or their wife is pregnant, or their girlfriend's pregnant, or whatever, I'm in the first couple episodes I made a point to kind of try to with our language rehumanize the unborn, and I think it's important to note that if your wife is pregnant with your first child, you're already a father, and it's hard for, I think, people to I don't want to say hard for people to grapple their mind around it, because they know that intellectually, but try to make it so that you, instead of saying you're a father or mother to be, you are a father. You're just a father to a very, very young child. All right, and I'm going to see if I can figure out where I was going with that first part. Yes. So within the next couple months, I'm going to be dealing with a newborn, and there is one thing that was crazy effective when we first had Micah. It was this book that we read called Happiest Baby on the Block, and I don't know if this is your thing, but it worked really well. I'm not going to try to tell you guys how to parent or whatever, because each parent figures out how to do it on their own. They figure out what works, what doesn't work. But for me, for Micah, it was this thing where it was a combination of you swaddle the baby, you give him a pacifier, you lean him on his side, and you actually, it almost looks like you're basically shaking him, but you're not doing it in a way that would induce that shaken baby syndrome. Of course, you're doing it in a way that mimics the environment in the womb, which is something that you don't really think about. But when the baby's in the womb, he's constantly moving around, right? And then all of a sudden he comes out of the womb and he wants to go back to sleep or whatever. But for literally his entire life, he's been used to sleeping while moving. And then you put him in his bassinet or the side sleeper or the crib or wherever, and he's completely still. Now that if you're used to doing something for your entire life and it has to do with moving, and then all of a sudden you're still, it's going to be a bit of an issue. Another really interesting thing about this happiest baby on the block thing is that the child, while in the womb, will experience loud noises perpetually. It's almost like a loud droning noise of the inside of the mother's body, whether it's the sound of the amniotic fluid rushing around in and out of the ear, or in and around the ear. It doesn't go like deep inside the head or anything, but whether it's that or it's the noises being filtered in through the skin and through basically everything protecting him from the outside environment, it's a constant droning noise. And one of the cool things that the author of Happiest Baby on the Block suggested was that you actually lean down really close to the child, and without being piercing, make a droning noise. He uses a shh sound, but it was interesting when Micah was really young. He actually really enjoyed heavy metal, and I'm not going to complain about that. That's free. It was his favorite band to listen to because of the droning kind of sounds that they make was Demon Hunter. Now, Demon Hunter's pretty much at the top of my list when it comes to listening to heavy metal, but he also really liked the Vacuum Cleaner, which I'm not a huge fan of that, but they're actually, see, now it's going to be, just tips for if you're dealing with a newborn with Elijah on the fetal position. There's a whole bunch of apps you can have too. Hang on a sec, I'm going to grab my phone. I apologize if you don't care about this stuff, but it's really awesome. So there's this one called Relax Melodies, and if you search for it on the App Store, it's like a little moon in between two green leaves or something, and you can actually make it so that you have birds and like rain and a whole bunch of other things. So like, check this out. So it's raining right now, right? Nope, not anymore. Just birds. Oh, maybe you want a waterfall. Maybe you want some thunder. Okay, so the cool thing about this is because babies are so used to noise, this actually allows them to have a constant droning noise, and it just started again, and it has a constant droning noise, and this noise helps them go to sleep because that's what they've been used to for their entire life. So I'll put links in the show notes of this episode, which will be thefetalposition.com/9. I'll put links in the show notes for that. The Happiest Baby on the Block stuff. Again, I apologize if you're not going to be a parent anytime soon, or if you've already been a parent and you've already figured all that stuff out. But for the handful of guys, I know Matthew, if you're listening, I know your wife is expecting. I know Jerome, if you're listening, your wife is expecting. A handful of others have told me that they enjoy the stuff that I talk about when it comes to fetal development because it's basically where they are. At least they will be in a couple weeks. So yeah, that's that. Thanks for listening to that little totally impromptu, wasn't a part of my notes. Advice, I guess, from me about new babies. One more thing that I just mentioned in the show notes. I am going to be doing something a little bit different with the show notes. I've been kind of doing a very minimalistic show notes blog post type of thing where all I do is just say, here are the links that I talked about during the show. I like doing that because it's less work for me, but I've also noticed that people want to share some of the things that I've said, but the person that they're sharing it with doesn't listen to audio podcasts. They might listen to it if it was on a video, but because I don't have any sort of, I could record it off my computer, but I do this very late at night, so that's not pretty. And it requires a lot of video editing, and that's just a big hassle. Maybe some point when I'm making millions off of this show, I'll be able to do that. But anyway, so what I want to do is I want to make it more blog posty, where I have the show still, and actually listening to the audio, you get a lot more content because that's just how audio is. I am going to be kind of summarizing the arguments that I use in the show for the blog post, so that if you are interested in sharing it, like last week I did an episode on bodily autonomy, the arguments from there, and I just was like, man, I spent so much time researching this stuff, and I really just want a place to put it so that so somebody can use it. Like if someone brings up a bodily autonomy argument in a discussion and they would just want to know how to respond to it real quick, they don't have to listen to a 45-minute podcast. So I'm doing this because I love you, and I want it to be more easily shared and it's more easy for you to search for it, and search for answers and things like that. So I'm going to skip a couple of things that I was going to say. Okay, the last thing before we get into the violinist, I want to call your attention to this one comic strip, an online comic strip. I'm assuming you guys know, at least a handful of you guys know Adam 4D. His website is adam4d.com, and his tagline is a curiously Christian webcomic. The one that I want to call your attention to is one that he does a brilliant job of just putting into an image what we talked about on episode number 7. Nope, I lied. Episode number 3. He talks about trotting out the toddler, but he does it in a way that doesn't actually use those words. I'm just gonna read it. It's a couple of panels right now. So there's these two women. They're standing in like a living room area, and the one woman on the left says, "I've really thought a lot about this, and I've decided I'm just not ready to have this child. I'm just not. I'm not responsible enough to be a parent. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I haven't gotten very far in my career. There are things I want to experience first. The father isn't even in my life. It wouldn't even be fair to the child, to the kid." And the other woman says, "So what are you saying?" Then she responds, "I'm not going to keep it. I'm going to, terminate." And the other woman responds, "But Jenny, how can you say that? That's your baby." And Jenny responds, "I knew you'd be against it, but listen, I've been reading a lot about the subject and need to make the right choice for me. I'm under no obligation to be held hostage by another being which will alter my life dramatically and is totally dependent upon me for survival, no matter what anyone else says." And the last comic strip zooms out, and the woman on the right says, "Jenny, he's 6 months old," and is pointing at the toddler, or the infant at her feet. And so that kind of I like that, because it shows that all these things that Jenny said were typical kind of pro-abortion arguments. That they don't have enough money, the father isn't in the parent, isn't in her life. That she's under no obligation to be held hostage by another human being that'll alter her life dramatically. She still wants to go to school, stuff she wants to see. All this stuff is stuff that you hear people say in abortion discussions. This is why abortion should be allowed, right? But what they're doing is they're assuming that the child is not human. So in order to be able to move the conversation forward to figure out whether or not that particular thing, that particular reason for an abortion is a good one, you just, what Scott Klusendorf and a whole bunch of other people have called trotting out the toddler. I'm not going to go into any more detail about that this episode. But what I can do is, if you go to thefetalposition.com/3, I did an episode focusing entirely on trotting out the toddler. So feel free to check that out if you're interested in that. And I'll put a link in the show notes for Adam 4D's comic as well. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and jump into Judith Jarvis Thomson's A Defense of Abortion. Before we dive in, I want to make a bit of a qualification. In the general category of bodily autonomy arguments, there are at least two subcategories. The quote-unquote sovereign zone and the quote-unquote right to refuse are the two categories. In episode 8, the last episode, I discussed the sovereign zone arguments, which can be referred to as the my body, my choice arguments. And this episode is going to be dedicated to the right to refuse style of bodily autonomy arguments. If you want to hear more specifically about the my body, my choice or the sovereign zone, check out episode 8, thefetalposition.com/8. To summarize, because this episode is a variant of a bodily autonomy argument, I'm just going to summarize it real fast. The bodily autonomy argument says that the woman has a right to an abortion at all points during pregnancy. If the child isn't viable yet, the child dies. So be it. If the child is viable, you still have the right to remove the child from the womb, but because it's after viability, the child can survive. So either way, you have the right to do what you want with your body. This is why some people will draw the line at viability. Now, I go more into this last episode, but it seems weird to me, primarily because what they're essentially saying when they draw the line of viability is when the child is completely helpless, you can kill him. But when the child is almost completely helpless, it's a little bit weird to kill him. A viable child has a right to your assistance because he's helpless. You can't just abandon the child on the side of the road in the middle of the winter. But when the child isn't yet viable, is even more helpless, and he doesn't have the right to your assistance there, yeah, I don't know. Check that out. More bodily autonomy arguments at thefetalposition.com/8. I'm glad I'm not going to be saying bodily autonomy anymore because apparently my brain just doesn't feel like spitting that out correctly. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and jump back to The Violinist. And if you want to go ahead and read that article, I would suggest you do that now because I'm going to be directly addressing her article. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, you know what? I'm going to play some fun little music for you so that you can listen to the music while reading the article that you can find on the show notes page, thefetalposition.com/9. Dang it, wasn't that just delightful? I hope you finished in that 10 seconds, because if you didn't, we're moving on without you. But you know what? The beauty of this is you can actually pause the show and continue listening after you finished. So if you haven't finished, go ahead and pause it, and then, you know what? You're probably not going to do that. You might be listening to this while you're driving. But you know what? I'm going to do my best to give her argument the best possible treatment that I can. That's my job, right? That's why you listen to me. All right, let's go. So at the end of episode 7, I actually read a little bit of the violinist the violinist analogy from Thomson's paper. I'm going to go ahead and do that again, just because I want to be as fair as possible. I don't want to misrepresent it, but it's fairly short. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the introduction as provided by Judith Jarvis Thomson. This is her speaking. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you. Last night, in the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, "Look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still, they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug, you would have to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment, and you can safely be unplugged from you. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede this situation? No doubt. It would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness. But do you have to accede to it? What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years, or longer still? What if the director of the hospital says, 'Tough luck, I agree, but now you've got to stay in bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life?' Because remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. So you cannot ever be unplugged from him. I imagine you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with the plausible-sounding argument that I mentioned a moment ago." The argument that she presented a moment ago was a pro-life argument. As she states it, it says this: "Every person has a right to life, so the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so it outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed. An abortion may not be performed." All right, so this is me now, coming back to me. I'm not going to read from Thomson anymore. The argument itself, if this is the first time you've heard it, it sounds pretty convincing, right? It seems like, well, yeah. I mean, I don't know of anybody who would say that you have like some kind of legal obligation to stay plugged into a violinist who's been hooked up to you. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, a lot of times when someone hears this argument for the first time, they're almost caught off guard. I remember hearing Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason. I don't remember when I heard him say this. It may have been in his book Tactics. Even if it's not, I'm going to put a link to that book in the show notes because it's great. Greg Kokel does a really good job of describing his rebuttal to this in an argument that he has on Stand to Reason called Unstringing the Violinist. But when I'm nearly positive it was in the book Tactics. So he said that when he first heard this argument on the radio, that he had to pull over because he wasn't sure how to answer it right away, and he needed time to kind of decompress and get his bearings and figure out how exactly to attempt to address this argument. So it's not like it's something that's just a stupid argument. One of the worst responses I've heard to this is, "Well, that doesn't make any sense because that would never happen. The Society of Music Lovers would never kidnap me and hook me up to a violinist." That's not the point, right? That's the whole point of having thought experiments, is to suspend whether or not it's a realistic situation and focus on the morally relevant things, like what would you do in this particular situation. Thought experiments are designed to highlight particular moral dilemmas in a way that a normal everyday life situation may not. So now we're going to talk particularly about the argument, starting off with kind of surface level objections and getting more philosophical as we go along. The first thing I want to point out is I may have used the word argument, but technically it's not an argument. Thomson is just giving a counterexample. If you do not consent to the violinist using your body, you have a right to unplug. And in the same way, if you do not consent to the child using your body, you have a right to unplug or to abort. She isn't making an argument per se, but she's using the thought experiment to point out that there is something wrong with the pro-life argument, saying that the child has a right to use the body at all costs. The first initial response is that there are some people who would just say, well, you can't unplug. This is what's often referred to as the Good Samaritan argument. Some people say that they would not unplug themselves because they feel they have an obligation to stay connected, but they're not going to force other people to do it. They would see this staying connected as a supererogatory act that is not something that should be compelled by law. An action is supererogatory if it is not required, but it is something that it goes above and beyond. So they would see the act of staying connected and allowing the violinist to use their kidney as an activity that goes above and beyond the call of duty, basically. The way that I see this is for me personally, I would probably stay connected, but I can't imagine that I would feel comfortable saying that the law should force other people to stay connected. I touched on this in episode 7 about being able to force someone to donate their kidney or donate blood. We may have a moral obligation to do it, but we can't have a legal obligation to do this. If it gets into the concept of rights, I would strongly suggest you guys if you're interested in knowing about that discussion, go to thefetalposition.com episode, or thefetalposition.com/7. It's episode number 7. You can find it fairly easily. The episode itself is called Forced Kidney Donations and a Peek at the Violinist. So you can already see how all these arguments are kind of intertwined. And having an understanding of the other arguments, bodily autonomy and the being able to donate a kidney, it helps you to understand how the violinist reasoning works. The thing about having a moral obligation but not necessarily a legal obligation actually falls in line with some pro-choicers' perspective that says that they wouldn't get an abortion, but they would never force someone else to carry a pregnancy to term by law. They view allowing the child to use their body as supererogatory. And this is where I see the disanalogy. The morally relevant parallels are not parallel, and an analogy only works if the key parallels are actually parallel. So what we have to do is we kind of got to pick apart the argument, or the analogy, to figure out why it's different than pregnancy. And then we can also figure out whether or not the child being allowed to use his mother's body would be a supererogatory act on behalf of the mother. All right, so for some initial thoughts and some surface level objections, in the analogy, you are bedridden. Now, this is a very unlikely, statistically speaking, situation for most pregnant women, unless they have some problems with their cervix or they may have preeclampsia. But from my understanding of both of those, you're not actually necessarily bedridden for your entire pregnancy. It's just something that happens later on. Actually, a friend of mine, she is currently in one of those situations, and actually, I know somebody else who's in the other situation. So getting back to the analogy, so here we have an analogy that requires a very unlikely situation where the woman is bedridden and cannot live her life normally during pregnancy. So if we wanted to make the analogy parallel to a real situation, it would have to be someone who would be pregnant and then immediately bedridden, right? And because pregnancy is not usually like that, I think we have good reason to think, at least right off the bat, how about let's take a step back and think a little bit more about this. The second, a little more surface level-ish type of objection is that I am not, let's say that I am the person connected to the violinist in this analogy. I am not responsible for being connected. In pregnancy, in the vast majority of cases, the person who is with child is at least partially responsible for while the child exists. This gets into something that's called the responsibility objection. So it's important to note here that this means that the violinist analogy is only applicable in the cases of rape. The violinist becomes connected to someone who did not consent to anything that would normally lead up to being connected to the violinist. Now, as a society, we recognize that responsibility for being the cause of someone's dependent state is a reason to expect them to behave in a certain way. We expect fathers to pay child support or to help out at the home or something like that, and avoiding that responsibility is socially unacceptable. So as a society, we recognize that if you helped bring a child into the world, you got to help out. So going back into the analogy, at this point, the analogy, as Thomson presented, could only be valid, a truly valid analogy, if the woman was raped and is now on permanent bed rest, right? Because she did not consent whatsoever. You did not consent whatsoever to the violinist being connected to you, and in order for the violinist to use your kidneys, you have to be on bed rest. But you know what? Let's make it better and look at it a little further. The relationship to you and the violinist is that he's a stranger, but in a rape, the woman has provided half of her DNA to create the child. So the unborn child is technically family. Don't misread me here. The unborn child is technically family, even though it is a terrible situation that caused the child to come into existence. But in order for the violinist analogy to be really analogous to a real pregnancy, it would have to be a woman who was involuntarily made into a surrogate mother for a child that was not hers, and immediately needed to be on bed rest. The people in the Society of Music Lovers are not only lovers of music, but apparently lovers of surrogate mothers as well. All right, so in order to make this analogy really still work, we have to have an immediately bedridden woman who was used as a surrogate for someone else's baby against her will. This is getting a little bit silly at this point, you think? Because we're just by creating a real-life scenario, by using the violinist's, the situation in the violinist analogy, you have to have such a narrow window that this analogy can actually be applied. I mean, since when is there ever a woman who was used as a surrogate for someone else's baby against her will and then immediately caused to be on bed rest? I mean, it could be just because I have limited knowledge, but I don't think I know of any case that this has actually happened. But let's dive a little bit more into the philosophically meaty differences between the violinist analogy and pregnancy, ones that are not just kind of trying to pigeonhole the applicability of the violinist. Because in reality, you can kind of always alter analogies to make them seem better, right? So if you had, let's say the person was like, okay, I get it. So let's imagine that it's a tiny violinist, like one of those, like a hobbit, a hobbit violinist. A hobbit has a right to life, and you can just carry him around on your back, right? And let's say that it was someone else's baby, and it was against your will. So that gets rid of the whole bedridden thing, and that it doesn't actually affect your life hardly at all up until the very end when the hobbit starts to get awfully wiggly. So you can, like I said, you can change the analogy to make it fit. So what I want to do with the next part here is to actually talk specifically about the reasons, the morally relevant reasons why the violinist argument fails to be an accurate representation of what can be done during pregnancy. All right, so jumping back to what I talked about earlier about the responsibility objection, let's imagine that I actually am the one who connected myself to the violinist. But actually, it's more than that. I am the reason the violinist needed to be connected to me because I was the one who made the violinist dependent upon me. Perhaps I poisoned him and made his kidneys stop working, and then I was like, I deliberately connected him to me because I wanted, I don't know, I'm a weird guy, and I just wanted that to happen. In that case, it seems obvious that I am obligated to stay connected, right? I purposely caused the violinist to be dependent, and then I connected myself to him voluntarily. Now, we all know, at least most of us, know that sex creates dependent people. If you cause someone to need you, you have an obligation to take care of them. This seems rather obvious, right? So, like I was saying earlier, when we're talking about the violinist, I don't think it's a superfluous objection to say that this really can only apply in the cases of rape. And that's because if as soon as you start doing any of this stuff voluntarily or you consent to these things, you have much more of a responsibility to take care of the effects or the outcomes of your decisions than you would if you had no immediate decision-making capabilities in the situation. So to use an analogy to kind of push this point home, let's imagine we had there's a room that you can walk into this room and there's a button. The button says press for 25 to 40 minutes of pleasure, and there's a 7.9% chance of there becoming a baby coming out of this machine. So you will get pleasure if you press this button, but there's a slight possibility that a dependent infant will arrive on the scene because of you pushing that button. If you didn't push the button, the baby would not be there. But because you're about to push the button, it's a possibility that it might happen. Now imagine somebody walks in and says, man, I really like this button. It makes me feel real great. Then they walk over and they push the button. They feel really great for 37 minutes. And then, oh shoot, there's a baby there. Now, when they walked up and hit that button, all they really wanted was the pleasure, right? They weren't going in there expecting to have a child to have to take care of, right? But now they have the child because they are the ones who caused the child to come into existence. They have a moral obligation to take care of this child. I don't see any way around that. If you can think of something, let me know. But that seems like a pretty significant, it's almost a priori obvious. But yeah, so that I think is a pretty significant thing to think about when it comes to assessing the violinist argument. The next thing I want to talk about is whether or not the child and the violinist function in the same way. As I stated earlier, pro-choice advocates see staying connected to the violinist or to an unborn child as supererogatory. But are the two examples parallel in the relevant ways? I don't think so, and that's because the unborn child is not an intruder, whereas a violinist is. In the violinist example, we are using our kidneys to keep the violinist alive. This is an unnatural function of our kidneys. They are not designed to keep another person alive. They're designed to keep us alive. However, the womb is designed, whether by evolution or by God, whichever one you believe, the womb is designed to keep a child alive. In the womb, the womb, when it is performing its natural function, is preparing for a child or keeping the child alive. Food, shelter, medicine, safety, etc., etc., etc. The womb is designed for the child. But for whom are the kidneys designed? See what I mean? So the analogy shows that while other things may be parallel, the fact that we are using our bodies in an unnatural way makes it so that it is no longer analogous, at least properly analogous, to pregnancy. So a lot of times when people will say that the child is an intruder, you kind of got to think about what the word intruder means. Let's imagine that I'm sitting kind of up in my upstairs lofty area here, and imagine if a burglar came in, someone who is intruding on my home. If I don't kill a burglar, it is still immoral for that burglar to have invaded my private property. In the same way, if the child was really an intruder in the same way that a burglar is an intruder, wouldn't pregnancy itself be considered immoral? But I don't know of anybody who would consider the fetus's existence in the womb as the fetus doing something immoral. So I don't really see how people can hold the idea that the fetus is an intruder for a whole variety of reasons. The next thing I want to talk about here is the distinction between killing and letting die. The fatal series of events began before you were connected to the violinist in the analogy. But in abortion, you start the fatal series of events. There may be a moral obligation to someone who is dying, but initiating the fatal series of events on innocent human beings is wrong. Thomson seems to be ignoring the fact that in an abortion, you have a healthy child who is being actively killed. In the analogy, you have someone who is already dying. As Frank Beckwith says, euphemistically calling abortion the, quote, withholding of support, unquote, makes about as much sense as calling suffocating someone with a pillow the withdrawing of oxygen. And this is even more relevant when we're talking about abortion's past viability, the so-called partial birth abortions, because it's much more than just, letting die by taking away some nutrients. They're actually going in, and eventually I'm going to probably have to do an episode on the different types of abortions, but in what's called a D&E, the dilation and evacuation, they actually tear apart the child limb by limb. And this is fairly obviously active killing. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here is using analogies to kind of combat the analogy. The way that people construct analogies give you a particular perspective on the situation. In the violinist analogy, you are the pregnant woman, right? But there is another analogy that I'm going to read to you in a minute that is a reversal of the roles. In the reversal violinist, you are the unborn child. This analogy comes from Trent Horn. He is at least when I heard of him here, he was a guest on Life Report. It's on episode number 107, and it's called Refuting the Ultimate Pro-Choice Argument. His analogy or thought experiment he devised with Tony George, one of his colleagues, is based on the violinist analogy. And here he says, I'll put a link in the show notes to this episode, because if you have not listened to this episode and the understanding the pro-life argument or understanding the violinist argument, and also violinist reasoning. I'll put links to all three of those. Those are probably the top 3 episodes that they put out over on Life Report when they were actually having the show. But I'm going to go ahead and repeat to you what Trent Horn says in this show. He says, imagine you wake up in a hospital and you're connected to Thompson's violinist. You decide, you know what? I think it would be nice to stay plugged in, but I'm going to unplug from this guy. I can't stay here for 9 months. So you unplug, you walk out of the hospital, and you start to feel really nauseous and lightheaded. The director of the hospital runs in and says, oh my goodness, plug back in or you'll die. So you scramble into the bed and you plug into the guy. The director says to you, I'm terribly sorry, but last night you were kidnapped by the Society of Musical Pranksters, unlike the Thompson Society of Musical Lovers. And these pranksters, of which the violinist is a member, they have a lot of fun together, but they're pranksters. And because they're pranksters, every now and then they end up plugged into an innocent person. And when this happens, it destroys the innocent person's kidneys. But don't worry, if you stay plugged into the violinist, in 9 months, your kidneys will heal, and then you can go on your way. And you pass out, because this is just crazy. And then the violinist wakes up. He looks over at you and says, hey, he doesn't have the right to use my body without my consent. I'm not going to let him use my kidneys without my permission. He unplugs from you, walks out of the hospital, and you die of kidney failure, and you're thrown into the hospital incinerator. Now the question is, does the violinist in this case have the right to unplug from you? I think that does a good job of putting the analogy in perspective, because now we're no longer the pregnant woman, but we're now the child. And the pregnant woman in this case consented to the behavior that caused your dependence upon her. So again, this wouldn't work in the case of rape. That is clearly, like the violinist, something that was not considered in this analogy. But it's important to point out that for the most part, when people are using the violinist analogy, they're not using it to say, okay, it should be legal and morally permissible in the case of rape, but every other time, not so much. They're using it to try to justify the majority of abortions, at least up until viability, if not more. So the key here is, if that's the type of person that you're talking to, who is using the violinist analogy to justify any and all abortions, just use the reverse violinist. And I think they'll see the point rather quickly. Or if not, you can at least have a good discussion on the topic. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about is another thought experiment in a paper titled Good Samaritan on Life Support by Anthony George. He has an analogy where he uses, or a thought experiment where he uses, well, you know what, I'm just gonna read it. He says, let's say there are a pair of conjoined twins, Chris and Kyle. For the most part, the two get along well, but they have some different interests. Kyle, for instance, likes to party, while Chris would rather stay at home and read. Chris doesn't like it when Kyle drinks because it gets him drunk as well. It would be nice if the two were separated, but let's say Kyle is attached to Chris in such a way that he cannot survive without the attachment. Chris, on the other hand, could survive without Kyle. Like a rape victim, Chris did not choose to engage in any activity that foreseeably brought about his attachment to Kyle. Rather, the attachment was forced upon him, in this case by nature. Now, say a doctor tells Chris and Kyle that she could do a surgery to have Kyle removed, but it would be 9 months before she can safely do the operation because she would need to grow some spare organs Kyle needs to survive without his bodily attachment to Chris. The surgeon would derive these spare organs from induced pluripotent stem cells. The doctor is absolutely confident that in the 9 months the organ will be sufficiently developed to be used for the operation. She assures the brothers that after the operation they will live on to have healthy, independent lives. All of this sounds great. The only trouble is Chris, who earns a paycheck, knows his operation would be expensive. He's also aware of an alternative operation to detach himself from Kyle that would be cheaper, and he wouldn't have to wait 9 months to have it done. Also, Chris is convinced that the latter operation will be less painful to himself. So, without Kyle's consent, he goes to a separatist. This doctor doesn't judge Chris. He simply asks him, "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" And Chris answers, "Yes. It has been a difficult decision, but I really feel it is necessary. The separatist has his apprehensions, but figures that if he doesn't do the operation, Chris would try to do the operation himself and get hurt or die in the process. Kyle is a deep sleeper, and Chris was very careful not to wake him on the way to the doctor. When they arrive in the room, the doctor stabs Kyle in the heart with a needle and injects poison. Kyle has a heart attack, complete with spasms, for about an hour. He then dies. Now the doctor detaches Kyle from Chris and throws his corpse into a dumpster. Most everyone would consider Chris's actions morally repugnant to the point of being impermissible. That is, his actions should be against the law. All right, so now if we extrapolate the situation to those two doctors, the one who said that Kyle and Chris had to wait 9 months to be separated, and the other one said they can do it right away, it seems reasonable for Chris to wait 9 months in order for the organs to be grown so that both Chris and Kyle can live independently of one another, right? But if the bodily autonomy arguments, as promoted by the violinist analogy, if those were accurate or they were solid, as many people seem to assume, then there would be nothing wrong with what Chris did to separate himself from Kyle. He just did it a few months earlier than he would have had to otherwise. But it was his body, his choice, and Kyle had no right to invade upon his body and do so without his permission. All right, guys, so I hope this gives you something to think about in a way that kind of, how do you call it, defangs the violinist analogy. When you take what we've been talking about from this episode and from last episode, I think combining the two understandings of the bodily autonomy arguments, we can carefully and gently, but powerfully take down the two approaches to arguing for ultimate bodily autonomy and for the pro-choice position. Okay, so, all right, that's the end of the episode. If you guys would be so kind, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed and downloaded each of the episodes and left a rating or review on iTunes. It really helps me out. If you are listening to this on Theology Mixer Radio, please do the same for them as well. And if you are looking for the show notes for this page, feel free, go on to thefetalposition.com, and there are links along the right-hand side. But if you want to go directly to this one, it's thefetalposition.com/9. You can follow The Fetal Position on Twitter. You just search for that. Or go to thefetalposition.com/Twitter. And last but not least, we have a Facebook page where we are dedicated to talking about pro-life, pro-choice issues. It's a private Facebook group so that nobody outside of that group can see it. We have a small but active group at the moment, so I appreciate everybody in there. You can go to thefetalposition.com/Facebook if you want to join that. All right, and my rambling, I believe, is done. Episode number 10 will be up next. And that I'm going to see. I'm not entirely sure I got a week to figure this out. I'm not entirely sure what I want to do it on. I know I want to do it on some kind of what I'm calling the afterbirth segment. Every 5 episodes, I'm going to do something not on abortion. I guess we'll see. Maybe something big will come up in the realm of bioethics. If you have anything you want me to talk about, I can't guarantee that I'll do it because I always feel like I have to do a ton of research before each one of these episodes. But yeah, so leave me a comment, question, anything. And on that note, I'm going to go ahead and stop talking. All right, I'll talk to you guys next week.